But first, just 4 minutes after takeoff, the planned fly-past at the Absheim air display. To begin with, the low-level pass with undercarriage down went smoothly. But then, the moment when the crowds realised something was seriously wrong. They could clearly hear the twin engines screaming as the captain desperately tried to gain height.
Oh la la!
Oh yeah!
Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Oh no!
I can remember seeing this footage on the TV news all those years ago, and I can clearly remember thinking that this seemed like a completely unnecessary crash. To the untrained eye, it looked as if the pilot just came in too low, too slow, and basically misjudged everything and flew the aircraft straight into the forest that was right in front of him. Having now researched this accident to make this video, I can confidently say that my opinion hasn't changed all that much. Yes, there are a couple of mitigating factors, but long story short, the pilot flew his brand new Airbus, loaded with passengers, right into the middle of a forest. The aircraft in the video is an Airbus A320, and it was performing the first ever passenger flight of this model of aircraft. On board were 130 passengers and 6 crew. The passengers were a mix of reporters, there to cover the maiden voyage of the A320, and a group of lucky winners who had won tickets for this promotional flight after taking part in a raffle organised by local businesses. The date was June the 26th, 1988, a warm, clear Sunday, a day that would remain etched into the memories of everyone present for all the wrong reasons. The plan for that Sunday was for the A320 to leave Paris's Charles de Gaulle airport for a short flight to Basel-Mulhouse airport, where the passengers would board the plane for a sightseeing tour around Mont Blanc. However, having collected the passengers for the sightseeing trip, they were first scheduled to perform a quick low-level flyby at the local Habsheim airstrip, as they were having an air show that day, and having the Airbus do a low-level flyby over the runway would undoubtedly be the highlight of the event. The day was dubbed as an aerial baptism for the A320, but I don't think anybody expected it to be a baptism of fire. Piloting the A320 were captains Michel Asselineau and Pierre Mazières. Asselineau, the senior man in the cockpit, was very much involved with the introduction of the A320 into the Air France fleet, and was a vocal proponent of the modern electronic fly-by-wire system that was incorporated into the new plane. Although Asselineau had only picked his aircraft up from the factory 2 days previously, he had flown other A320s before. He was an ex-Air Force pilot and conducted many test flights of the A320 for Air France, pushing the plane to its limits. He probably had more experience of flying the A320 than any other pilot, and he was fully convinced of the plane's abilities and of his own abilities as a captain. Asselineau seems to me to have been the kind of pilot that revelled not only in his job, but in the kind of macho image that came along with it. Apparently his nickname in the company was Rambo, and here in these publicity shots for the A320, he clearly looks every inch the handsome debonair pilot, as much at home doing adverts for Patek Philippe watches as he is sitting in the cockpit. At this point, it's worth noting that this flyover would be the first time that either man had laid eyes on Habsheim airfield. They knew roughly where it was in relation to Mulhouse, so Asselineau's plan was to take off, simply fly around at 1,000 feet following the motorway north towards Mulhouse itself, and then when they spotted Habsheim airstrip, they would make a visual approach, descend to 100 feet, extend the flaps, lower the landing gear, pull the nose up to the max, and give the watching crowd a spectacle that they would not forget. Apparently, Captain Mazières was somewhat sceptical that this manoeuvre could be pulled off safely, but Asselineau assured him that the A320 was up to the job, and told him not to worry, as he had already pulled this stunt off at least 20 times before. Now, maybe that was true, but if it was, he neglected to mention that half of those had been performed in a simulator, and the other half over large empty runways where he could maintain a much higher airspeed. I think it's also worth noting at this point that there were 2 attractive female passengers in the cockpit who had been invited up there by the pilots to have the best view during the sightseeing tour. Now, it may be that Captain Azoulay might have felt the need to appear confident and cool-headed in front of the ladies, or maybe not. Maybe this guy just really thought that he was such a great pilot and he knew he could pull this stunt off no matter what. Anyway, with any doubts about Assoulin's flying ability having been firmly quashed, at 2:40 p.m, the A320 took off for Hatchim airstrip. At 2:24, Captain Azoulay spotted the airfield and began the descent down to 100 feet. As they got closer, he noticed that the crowds of spectators were not lined up along the main runway, but were in fact massed along the side of a shorter grass runway which intersected with the main one. He dropped the engines to idle. He turned the A320 to the left to line up with the grassy runway. Mazieres had extended the flaps and dropped the landing gear, and as the Airbus continued to drop towards the runway, the robotic voice of the terrain warning system chimed in the cockpit. Terrain, pull up, followed by the altimeter reeling off the current altitude. 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. Watch out for those pylons ahead. Do you see them? Said Mazieres. Azoulay blithely replied, Yeah, don't worry. 40 feet. 30 feet. Azoulay finally pulled the A320 out of the descent. They were too low. They were way too low. The engines were at idle, the nose was pulled up to the max, and the plane was a whisker away from stalling. But this was exactly the stunt that Azoulay had wanted to perform. A super low-level flyby with the nose pitch high at low speed. And it was at this point that Captains Azoulay and Mazieres noticed that there was a large forest directly ahead of them. Azoulay cranked the engines to the max, but it was way too late. There was simply not enough time for the engines to go from idle to getting up to giving enough thrust to get the plane to ascend. Captain Azoulay, no pretense of his cool head remaining, yelled out one word. And the spectators watched in disbelief as the brand new A320 gracefully ploughed its way straight into the treetops before disappearing from view. A couple of seconds later, a huge fireball erupted from the forest as the plane crashed into the ground. Incredibly, and I do find this incredible, at that point of impact, nobody had been killed. All 136 people on board survived the initial impact, but the right wing had sheared off. Burning jet fuel had sprayed all over the place, and the passengers were now in imminent danger of being burned alive inside the wreckage. Most of the emergency exits were inoperable, either leading directly into the path of the raging fire or being blocked by twisted foliage. Around the middle of the plane, some windows had broken and the floor had split open, and a wall of fire now divided the cabin. In the rear, passengers were able to calmly evacuate by the rear door, but in the front section, passengers scrambled in panic, pushing and shoving to reach the only available exit. This panic was completely understandable. The cabin was rapidly filling with thick, black, toxic smoke. One woman was screaming and shoving as her hair and her clothes were on fire. The only way out was partially blocked with splintered branches, which tore at the fleeing passengers who screamed in panic and pain as they tumbled out from the burning aircraft. But due to the professionalism of the cabin crew, almost everyone made it off alive. Almost everyone. Hervé Leerman, a 14-year-old quadriplegic boy who was unable to call out or move, was missed in the scramble to escape. 7-year-old Mariama Barry had been trapped by her seatback and was unable to do her safety belt. Her little brother had tried to free her, but he was swept away in the crush. Marie-Françoise Freuch, realising that a little girl was still trapped, ran back on board to try and find her, but she was overcome by smoke and collapsed. All 3 victims died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Due to the difficulty in reaching the crash site quickly, because it was in the middle of a forest, the Airbus A320 was almost completely consumed by the fire. Only the tail and the left wing remained intact. Nonetheless, 133 people from the 136 on board escaped with their lives. Seeing that crash footage, It's nothing short of miraculous that so many people managed to walk away from that fireball with just mostly minor injuries. The inquiry into the crash of this Airbus A320 was of massive importance to the European aerospace industry. If it was concluded that the aircraft was at fault, this would have devastating consequences for Airbus. The A320 was one of the first generation of fly-by-wire aircraft, which basically means that computers interpret the pilot joystick input and remotely control the flight surfaces of the plane. Now, this not only did away with the need for routing of mechanical systems, pulleys and wires and hydraulic piping, but it supposedly allowed the computer to fly the aircraft in a perfectly safe manner. For example, that might be something like overriding a joystick input from the cockpit, which would cause the plane to stall. So if it turned out that the onboard computer had prevented Captain Assouline from taking necessary evasive action, then the whole fly-by-wire process would have to be scrapped. On the other hand, if it was shown that pilot error had been the cause, then Airbus was off the hook and, wouldn't go bankrupt. After months of scrutiny of all the available data and running multiple real and simulated test flights, the result was in. There was nothing wrong with the plane. The fault lay squarely with the flight crew. Basically, they were not prepared to do that low-level flyby. In the view of the investigation, Assouline and Mazieres had made several errors of judgment. Having spotted the airfield too late, they had to drop the engines all the way down to idle to get down fast enough. Then there was the last-minute left turn to line up with the grassy runway. Their failure to properly recon the site meant that they had no idea that the forest was there. Captain Assouline took the A320 well below the minimum 100-foot level stipulated for the flyby. The investigators thought this was probably to show off to his female guests in the cockpit. And they did not leave enough time to get lift thrust from the idle engines. The pilot's behaviour that day had been almost reckless and showed overconfidence combined with poor judgment on the day. Captain Assouline was furious. He broke off all cooperation with the inquiry and went on TV claiming to be the victim of a cover-up. He was a scapegoat. The plane was the problem, not him. If the A320 would have allowed him to pull up more steeply, the crash would have been avoided. The engines didn't give him the thrust when he needed it, and so on and so on. It seemed that Air France's standard bearer for the A320 had suddenly become its biggest critic. In fact, the A320 did override Assouline's joystick input to pull up sharply, but this was only because that move would have caused the airplane to stall, and it would have pancaked into the forest, probably killing many more people in the process. In the end, all of Assouline's protestations did him no good. He, along with Pierre Mazieres and 4 other officials, were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Most received suspended sentences, but Assouline, bearing the brunt of the blame, got 6 months in prison. He boldly declared that he would fight this judgment in France's highest court of appeal, which he did, only for them to increase his sentence to 10 months in prison. And this time around, he had no avenues of appeal. He did his time. He was stripped of his pilot's licence, and as far as I know, he never flew for Air France again. I don't think that there's much to be said in his defence, but there were some contributing factors that were not Assouline's fault. Air France had failed to give him adequate information about where the crowds would be at the Hapsheim airfield. The forest wasn't marked on his chart, and he was given no opportunity to recon the airfield for himself prior to the day of the flight. Nonetheless, to perform such a risky, unprepared manoeuvre with a full load of passengers on board is, in my view, unforgivable. It's in my own opinion, but it seems to me to be a clear case of pilot hubris that resulted in senseless and completely unnecessary accident that claimed the lives of 3 innocent people. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was the aircraft that actually was to blame, and Assouline was in fact just an innocent scapegoat. It's possible, I guess, but somehow I doubt it.